Good afternoon. Masal khair, shalom. My name is Yoav Alon. No relations to Yigal Alon and the Alon plan. I would like first to thank the organizers that allowed me to come all the way from Tel Aviv and represent the other university. After we heard the diplomats and the negotiators, please, cameraman, please. Thank you. After we heard the diplomats and the negotiators, we can perhaps get a more detached perspective on Israeli-Jordanian relations, coming from the academia and civil society. And we have two distinguished speakers, Professor Moshe Maoz and Father Nabil Haddad. I will introduce them very shortly. But by way of introduction to our panel, I want to say that it must be clear by now that when we try to assess Jordanian-Israeli relations, we can say that high expectations quickly gave way to frustration, disappointments, and suspicion, especially from the Jordanian perspective. Gradually, Israel's peace with Jordan came to look more and more like the one Israel has with Egypt, namely limited to strategic cooperation and to governments rather than peoples, as was intended by the architects of the agreement, King Hussein and Prime Minister Rabin. Many of the promises for future cooperation, some mandated in the treaty, remained on paper. Nevertheless, the treaty withstood the outbreak of the Al-Aqsa Intifada of 2000 and the war between the Israeli and the Palestinians, a clear testimony to its solid foundation. 2 years ago, an American researcher published a book which tries to assess 10 years of peace between Israel and Jordan, and I want to read a very short quotation from her conclusion. The book is called Good Neighborly Relations by Donna Stewart, and she writes, though the Jordanian-Israeli peace cannot and should not be considered as a failure, it remains an incomplete peace in many ways, its expected potential unrealized, and its future outlook disheartening. In sum, Jordan and Israel largely failed to make the transition from peacemaking to peace building. That was an assessment of 10 years of the peace, and I think it's still a suitable way to describe 15 years of the peace. But I suggest that we'll wait and hear our speakers about the subject. I would like first to introduce our guest from Jordan, the very Reverend economist Father Nabil Haddad. Father Nabil Haddad is a real and relentless peacemonger. He's the founder and the CEO of the Jordanian Interfaith Coexistence Center of Amman. As an Arab Christian and native of Jordan, I believe from Irbid, right? I can do the trick as well, not only a judge. Father Haddad has worked as a peace activist in the Middle East for over 25 years, serving in a number of capacities in the fields of interfaith understanding and peace building, human rights, social and religious organizations, and activities. Just two examples from a long list of institutions and activities. Father Haddad served as the Director of Rights and Humanity International Jordan and as a chairperson of the Justice, Peace and Human Rights Committee for the Middle East Council of Churches. He was also a member of the Jordanian Royal Commission for Human Rights, appointed by His Majesty King Abdullah II. Father Haddad, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace be to all of you. First, I'd like to extend my thanks to the Truman Institute for inviting me to participate in this gathering, although I was not a negotiator in the 90s, and to celebrate the marking of 15 years. I also would like to extend my thanks to my friend and colleague and partner in peace building, Dr. Georgette Bennett, the very well-renowned Jewish American and peacemaker, who insisted that I accept the invitation, and I am really glad to be here today to talk to you. As I said, I am not a negotiator, and I come here before you this afternoon with a sincere message, a heartfelt message, on behalf of myself, the Catholic priest, the Jordanian, the Arab, the believer in, and the seeker of peace. Friends, ours is a difficult era that we are partaking in. We live in the most troubled piece of land on earth, the longest conflicted piece of land in the world. It is troubled, yet holy. And it's holy because of three faiths that seek a human and peaceful existence upon its dust and sand, a dust and sand filled with the bones and blood of our shared ancestors. These are the facts we cannot deny. We are related for better and for worse. We are related to one another in our humanity, our longings, our dreams, and our shared past. When the treaty between Israel and Jordan was created in 1994, it launched a period filled with the promise of peace that all of us desperately wanted. We began to believe that at long last we would see an end to the bloodshed, sorrow, and pain we had grown up with. A settlement for and in this troubled region. It is for me heartbreaking to say, 15 years later, that promised peace has grown but cold, hardening attitudes, creating a self-imposed prison for Israel, living in a fortress behind walls and wire that reeks of paranoia and implosion, as well as a prison of despair and suicide by desperation for the youth of Palestine. I do not believe Israelis want this any more than Palestinians want this, and people on both sides wring their hands, cry out their political slogans, and look at short-term wins and losses. The passage of time holds us all hostage to a potential eternity of absolutely nothing. There is no other alternative but to pursue salam, peace, shalom. I speak to you as a priest. The position of Christians, the teachings of my Lord Jesus Christ, and that of the church throughout the world is, has, and will always be a position that stands for justice, for the oppressed. Justice, dear friends, in this case that demands security and peace for every Israeli, and at the same time a right for self-determination and security in a homeland for every Palestinian. Why is this so difficult? And why has this failed so miserably these past 15 years? There is no celebration of peace in this holy land, my friends. Peace is as cold as the ink on which the treaties was signed. And today, it is our right to ask, what is there to really celebrate? We have failed King Hussein and Prime Minister Rabin. May God bless their souls. We have failed all those who thought peace was possible. We have allowed their efforts to look vain, foolish, because the 15 years mark of this treaty is a reminder of what we have failed to do and accomplish during that time. The absence of regional peace is a 15-year table of missed opportunities for all. The treaty signed was a commitment not only to get carrots and mango, but to respecting the rights of the other, and a pledge of courage on behalf of leadership that would work to achieve a peaceful environment for our people, one that would encourage economic development, cooperation to protect the water resources, environment, tourism, people-to-people diplomacy, and more and more. 15 sad years later, the world of faith, and I belong to that as you do, the world of faith as well as my country, Jordan, are very concerned for the welfare of our holy city of Jerusalem, where actions that try to disrupt its peace, its reality today, are of the highest importance to the people belonging to all three faith traditions. And speaking as a Jordanian, for us Jordanians, we have a special relationship to Jerusalem, acknowledging its sensitive nature and its sanctity for millions around the world. We cannot afford at this time to see actions, unilateral actions in Jerusalem, be undertaken to jeopardize its sanctity and current reality. My Pope, Benedict XVI, recently stated that walls are easily built, but sooner or later they fall. And this is what we must acknowledge, that the status quo cannot be the settled way of life for people here if they want to ever live in peace. We desire a lasting and just peace. We cry for a lasting and just peace for all, where a person's rights are recognized, respected, and upheld by the rule of law, not the rule of gun. What future do we all have together, knowing that we are related by centuries of the past? Will we allow more centuries to pass where generations can look back on us and see our continual failures of creativity and peacemaking efforts? My friends, as an Arab, I say that the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 offers us an unprecedented opportunity to resolve this conflict and work toward a better future. It is not just about a two-state solution. It is a 57-nation solution. The world is changing as we speak, and we must change with it. There is no more room for stagnation, missed opportunities, or status quo. It has only brought pain, sorrow, bloodshed, greed, and what is called the status quo. What exactly do we mean by the status quo? A Latin term translated meaning an existing state of affairs that one seeks to preserve. I ask you, brothers and sisters, in the halls of power, we hear this term used, and yet I ask myself, as the Arab Christian who coexisted, who lived with, who learned the art of coexistence as a Christian with his brothers and Muslim and sisters, the Muslims, I say, who in their right mind would wish to preserve this state of affairs? It is a position of stagnation, one that denies the very clear mandate given to us, each one of us, of our religions and our biological nature. As a man of faith, I say, we people of the three Abrahamic traditions here, in this most holy of lands, for all of us, have seen nothing but emptiness in the picture of life for us all. We stand witness as we see all of our societies struggle with their spiritual emptiness, that only continuous, relentless conflict brings to a society living in emotional anxiety for decades. The result has been a lessening of our shared humanity. We as people of faith know that everyone loses in war and conflict. We know that no matter what you call it, in military terms, a conflict, a war, we have seen that one war begets another, and yet another, and yet another, and that our spiritual lives adapt, unfortunately, just as our human bodies experience a high level of stress. We adapt until we believe that life can be none other than what we are seeing, and that this is to be our lives. And ultimately, we pass this belief along to our children for their future. Not everyone has come to believe in this collective popular mythology. Ladies and gentlemen, a number of moderate Jordanian religious leaders, and we have many of them in Jordan, began as early as 2003 in the light of 9/11 disaster to move into what I would call into action of a diplomacy of religious leaders in order to combat the negative view of life in all its fanatical forms. We created the Jordanian Interfaith Coexistence Research Center to launch an effort of high-level exchanges and encounters, so that we were engaging one another in combating the stereotypes that exist between followers of different faiths. We wanted to provide a clearer picture of what relationships could be between people, and that my country, my homeland, Jordan, is a model of peaceful coexistence between its people, Muslims and Christians, supported by a political will, a Hashemite support. In 2004, King Abdullah II provided the Amman message that talks about Islam. A document in 6 brief pages spoke about the true brotherly concepts of love and peace that are contained within the religion of Islam. Being the selfish Christian who wanted to live in peace, who wanted for his church, his community, his nation to enjoy peace within our society, we took that document. We adopted that document, and this very Arab Christian was the first one to carry the Amman message just before the ink of that document became dry, and delivered this to the Security Council at the UN. I gave it to the permanent ambassador of the United States. And I said, sir, I come to you with a prescription to combat fanaticism, extremism, and terrorism. This is a prescription. Islam, the moderate Islam. And when I was asked, why am I so interested? I said, I am not evangelizing Islam. I am not preaching Islam. But I am the selfish who wants to live in peace, and I select, I adopt to choose the moderate camp to build an alliance for peace. In 2005, our organization held a conference which we called the Amman Message in Action. Christians, Muslims, and Jews came together in support of His Majesty's efforts. And one of the main speakers whom I was proud to present and introduce at that international conference was the lady whom is being honored by this conference. I'm talking about Georgette Bennett. I introduced her in Amman, 2005, in that conference, as the lady who speaks not on behalf of the Jews as a Jewish lady, but she speaks also on behalf of all women and men. Christians, Muslims, and Jews came together in support of His Majesty's efforts, rallying the three religions under one roof, breaking bread with one another in fellowship and peace, showing our communities the way forward to peaceful coexistence, and that such a thing was still possible for a shared future. The blossoming of interfaith engagement work led by my country, Jordan, was the Common World document initiated by Jordan's Prince Ghazi. This document, which is called A Common World Between You and Us, Love of God and Love of Neighbor, has circulated throughout the world, and I think my colleague on this panel and I, we were together at Yale University last year, and has gained hundreds of signatories to it from Muslims and Christians, and was encouraged by so many Jewish leaders, as it seeks to unite voices of peace everywhere in a symbol of solidarity based on the understanding of love of God and love of neighbor. Not allowing for roadblocks to be placed in the way, our relentless strides are crucial, ladies and gentlemen, to keep reaching and extending the hand of friendship and trust between peoples. Religious leaders considered leading communities must understand the need to promote an education of peace among people, to work and live peacefully so that the future could be a bright one. Friends, it is crucial that we begin giving. We are talking about 15 years. We need to look for the future. The future is not ours only. It is the right of the youth. And we need to see the youth in this conference, in this symposium. It is crucial that we begin giving our youth the opportunity to receive a valid passport toward their own future here in this region. Without knowing and understanding the perspective of our near neighbor, how can we speak of a life of peace, of interfaith engagement, of worldly performance and sophistication that will be required for their future? My friends, back in 1994, and I would like to follow the path that I heard today, I would like to talk little history. Back in 1994, when the Oslo Agreement was signed, this little tiny priest, I knew right then it would not last. I knew it because the branches of people influence, people power, and I mean the representatives of religion, were not present at that or involved. They were not there. And I always said, why wouldn't they bring a priest, a rabbi, and an imam, and just ask them to be there present, fully dressed in their religious clerical attire, and to make sure that they don't speak, because every time you give any man of religion the microphone, they never finish, even when they receive a 5-minute notice, okay? And just to show the endorsement of religion for peace. I see that the religious element was absent. And I knew it because the branches of people power, the representatives of religion, were not present or involved to support in their third track diplomacy of religious leaders. Now, many years later, the religious leaders need to stand ready to help piece back our shattered and broken region. We need to stand ready to help the decision makers, the leaderships, make justice prevail. The moderates, and I believe all of us here are members of their camp, the moderates in this region have been gathering resources in order to help our people as we all strive together to end extremism and begin to plant the seeds necessary for a peace-filled new life here in this Holy Land. Leaders in my country, Jordan, are increasingly involving our youth in the process of reshaping our society with hope and a great act of courage. We must understand that to strive toward life with all its risk is an act of courage. And many of the gentlemen that spoke before me have depicted a clear picture of their efforts reflecting that act of courage. that begin with great leaders such as the late King Hussein and Prime Minister Rabin, Eisenhower and Truman of this institute. It is leaders as these who understood that reaching toward trust and reconciliation must always be a path of leadership. I am a Christian priest, and I am not afraid to risk and ask that you think, we all think, of our ancestors and our people and their future. Let us look around with open eyes to see how hatred, selfishness, isolation, suspicion is harming and destroying our holy land. Jerusalem is our heart and soul. It is for all of us here, but also for our brothers and sisters, the Muslims, the Christians, and Jews throughout the world. Jerusalem is the city of peace, is crying out to be reclaimed and honored, not destroyed and butchered in pieces with concrete and wire. Our children push toward peace. They look at the 15 years and push toward peace with their lives. They deserve to see us all use our courage to risk on their behalf with our own lives if necessary. Otherwise, where will they see courage and valor, those most noble of attributes for themselves and their own futures? We must show them the way to courage, to valor, to peace and coexistence. Now, after 15 years, is the time. If not now, then when? Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Haddad, for words, powerful words which came from your heart and hopefully entered ours. Our next speaker needs no invitation in this, needs no introduction in this venue, but he certainly deserves one. Professor Moshe Maoz is a professor emeritus of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies and a senior fellow of the Truman Institute. He is a world authority on the history of Syria from Ottoman times until the present. He published 20 books and many, many articles on many issues regarding the Middle East. He also served as an advisor to the Israeli government and the Knesset on Middle Eastern affairs. He is going to lecture on Israel's peace with Jordan and Egypt, the test of implementation. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I deeply appreciate your patience. This is a time of siesta, and I recall also what Abba Iban used to say, never talk to a hungry crowd, but what choice do I have? Anyway, in the last few days, His Majesty King Abdullah II gave some interviews to Italian newspaper, to Israel, claiming that peace between Jordan and Israel is cold and is getting even colder. Unfortunately, he's right. Especially if I interpret his notion on the people-to-people level. It's cold. Maybe it's a bit better than between Israel and Egypt and Israel on this level. But if we look at the other level of leadership, the senior leadership, especially the time of Hussein and Rabin, which was discussed here quite at length, and also part of the elites, political, military, economic, and academic elites, peace, even on this level, is quite warm or lukewarm, better than the Egyptian-Israeli one. And of course, there are many reasons for the differences. Strategic, historical, personal, psychological, economic. I won't go into all of them. Just to give you some example, speaking about the historical background, strategic relations, being an historian, I can go back to 1919, the Faisal-Weizmann agreement. Weizmann was a senior member of the Hashemite family. And the agreement, which was never fulfilled, is a symbol of coexistence between Arabs and Jews. Never, ever since there, you had such an agreement, 1919. And then, of course, you remember the flirt between King Abdullah and Mrs. Golda Meir, a political flirt, of course. And the Israeli leaders alone, not you, Peres, Dayan, were bragging who had more Hussein hours, who saw Hussein more time. They did it secretly some 60 times. And there were much coordination between Jordan, or Transjordan before, and Jordan and Israel, or the Zionist Yishuv, on the Palestinian issue. From the mandatory period up till now, I would say, through Black September. This was just one highlight. 1973, when reportedly the late King Hussein came to Golda Meir to warn 2 weeks before the Yom Kippur War, 73 war, that the Egyptians and Syrians are going to attack. Reportedly, she didn't believe him. And then the London Agreement of 1987, again between Israel and Jordan. I suspect that it was not ripe, but still it was an attempt. Going back, the 1950 non-aggression agreement, which was almost there between King Abdullah and the State of Israel. And very importantly, 1953, the Johnson Plan, the American engineer, Johnson, water engineer that laid a design for sharing the water of Jordan and Yarmouk between the countries in the region, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. Only Jordan and Israel kept the agreement secretly for years, before the 15 million tons of water. It was kept all along. Though it was, in a way, a de facto peace between Jordan and Israel until 1994. Of course, there were a number of wars in between. After all, we are in the Middle East, 48 and 67, but it was a de facto peace. By contrast, because Egypt was different, and I'm not commenting, I'm not criticizing, I'm just setting the facts, and facts are sacred, opinion is free. There were 5 wars, 48, 56, 67, 69, 73, and the great rivals, and a different approach to the Palestinian issue. Egypt supported a Palestinian state all along, Jordan now also, but not for many years. Siege on Israel, and the peace with Israel was, yes, a strategic peace, but also in order to contain Israel from expansion into the region. It was not a warm peace. It's not, still not, and again, I'm not criticizing, I'm just setting the to give you an example, which is still going on, NPT, the Egyptians still insist that Israel will sign the NPT. Again, reportedly, Israel has a nuclear capability, and Egypt is not very happy about it. So, and of course, there were also many agreements and tactical cooperation. Now, to give you just one example of the kind of peace, or the temperature of the peace, King Hussein time and again spoke about warm peace, and here I quote, is the first ambassador to Israel, Dr. Marwan Muasher, in a conference in Amman in September 1995, he stated, I quote, "The peace we seek with Israel is a warm one, going beyond the mere signing of agreements between governments to normal interaction between people, as the only model that ensures prosperity and economic sustainability through cooperation and interdependence." Now, by contrast, in his speech in the Israeli Knesset in November 1977, I was there, I remember it, President Sadat, he had a great, of course, initiative coming to Israel, but he was very harsh from his point of view, he spoke on peace based on justice for the Palestinians and not on occupation of the land of others. He depicted Israel as a fait accompli and urged it to give up, I quote again, once for all, the dream of conquest, the belief that force is the best method of dealing with the Arabs. So he was very, very critical of Israel at the time. And then also in the negotiations about the border, Sadat, late Sadat, Allah yarhamu, strongly refused to make even minor territorial concessions to Israel, unlike King Hussein, who agreed under Rabin premiership in 1994 to a land swap with Israel, which was discussed before. Another example, of course, is thinking about visits. Hussein came to Israel to visit, and he gave his condolences to families who were affected in the Naharaim case. He flew over, as we heard before, over Israel. Mubarak has not visited Israel since he came to power, except for one occasion on the funeral, funeral of Rabin in 95, for just a few hours. And again, it's meaningful. It has some political, of course, political meaning. Now, then I give you another example, which I mentioned earlier by passing, the question, the Palestinian question, and Jerusalem. And here again, Israel and Jordan had something in common, unlike Egypt and Israel. To give us the example of Jerusalem, in the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan, 1994, Article 9 of the treaty stipulates that, quote, Israel respects the present special role of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in the Muslim holy shrines in Jerusalem. When negotiations of the permanent status take place, Israel will give high priority to the historical Jordanian role in these shrines. But the PLO, as you know, and most Arab countries, including Egypt, rejected this stipulation on the plea that it reflected Jordan's recognition of Israel's sovereignty over East Jerusalem. I mean, well, either or not, but this is a very important example of the kind of cooperation that at least was envisaged at that time. But, paradoxically, Israeli actions in East Jerusalem and the West Bank after the signing of the Jordan peace agreement embarrassed Amman and hindered the peace and normalization. These actions, including the opening of the archaeological tunnel, the Hashmonaim tunnel, close to the Aqsa in 1996. This was the time of Bibi Netanyahu, his first term of office. And then under Sharon, the visit of, under Barak, the visit of Ariel Sharon on the Haram Sharif, the Temple Mount, in 2000, I think 28th of September. And these events caused great bloodshed, mostly among Palestinians, while Sharon's visit triggered the eruption of the Al-Aqsa Intifada, inducing Jordan at the time to withdraw its ambassador to Israel. Other Israeli actions against Palestinians also contributed to the deterioration of Israeli-Jordanian relations, such as the continuous expansion of Jewish settlements around Jerusalem, the West Bank, as well as the attempted assassination of Hamas leader Khaled Mashal in Amman in 1997. I don't want to spoil your afternoon to tell you more examples, but this is the situation. And I mean, speaking about this, I recall a book by Avi Schleim about the biography of King Hussein, that he mentioned that even King Hussein was very happy to make an understatement of the approach, especially of Netanyahu, let alone also the message that was given from time to time, not only right-wing Israelis, but politicians. Jordan is Palestine. And this is frightening for Jordanians, of course. And it's still going on, not by the government, but by others, and it's not very helpful. Now, Sadat and his successor Mubarak maintained peace relation with Israel, largely because Egypt has benefited from the US economic and military aid, as well as from the direct and indirect economic peace dividends, including the annual US grant of $2.3 billion, the qualifying industrial zone, QIZ, with the United States, the gas deal with Israel, revenues from reopening the Suez Canal, the Sinai oil fields, and the growing tourism. All of this benefited the Egyptian economy, but despite these dividends, Egyptian leaders have neither pushed for warm peace and for normalization with Israel, nor sought to overcome their domestic ideological and social constraints. In comparison, peace dividends benefited Jordan by reducing the foreign debt, increasing foreign investment and aid, obtaining US grants through the QIZ agreement, as well as increasing revenues from tourism and trade with Israel. And in contrast to the Egyptian leaders, King Hussein used this fruit of peace, so to speak, to gain public support for his policy of normalization with Israel, although he succeeded only partly. And we know that there were many agreements that were not implemented. Yesterday I heard a great excerpt on Jordan from the other place, Shimon Shamir, Professor Shimon Shamir. He was the first ambassador to Jordan, and he said, I couldn't believe my ears that there were 164 projects between Jordan and Israel. None was implemented. Why? I mean, he put the responsibility on both sides, but mostly on Israel. Abdullah II, His Majesty, while maintaining the peace treaty, has not insisted, according to the reading of many scholars, not insisted on normalization with Israel, and has cooled relations, and even criticized, and we saw it, for failing to settle the Arab-Israeli conflict, notably the Palestinian issue. And you know, Jordan under Second Abdullah, was a party to the initiative, the Arab Peace Initiative, Saudi Peace Initiative. And he was very disappointed that it's not going to work. Indeed, the unresolved Palestinian problem and the status of East Jerusalem, alongside the unchanged psychological barrier, Hagiz Nafsi of Sadat, he said that 90% of the conflict is psychological barrier, which is true. All of these have remained the major reasons for strained peace between Egypt and Israel, Jordan and Israel. Israelis have been disappointed, suspicious, not all of them, and concerned about hostile attitude of Egyptians and Jordanians, and believe that Palestinian issue is a pretext rather than a reason for this hostility. However, a considerable number of Israelis, Jordanians, and Egyptians and Palestinians have worked together in many NGOs for the fair solution of the Palestinian problem. And I want especially here to congratulate Crown Prince Hassan. And of course, and what you have done is a relentless effort to bring together Palestinians, Israelis, Jordanians, Christians, Jews, in his interfaith activities. Now, there have been a lot of work on this, but in my opinion, the impact has been marginal, because leaders make the difference. Grassroots are very important, but leaders are more important. To take an example of Sinai in Begin, Egypt, before the evacuation, before the peace treaty, Egypt and Israel, 80% of the Israelis were against giving Sinai to Egyptians, even for peace. Even for peace. And Dayan said, better to have Sharm el-Sheikh without peace than peace without Sharm el-Sheikh. He changed his mind because he said he wasn't a donkey. And the Israelis also changed their mind after Begin signed the peace and gave back Sinai. And this is leadership. Today, we don't have this leadership. Not that I'm a fan of Begin, no. But this is exactly an example of what leadership can do. Now, similarly, many more Egyptians and Jordanians wish to coexist with Israel, provided they enjoy the economic fruits of peace. But only a small number have directly benefit from this fruit of peace, while most of them have not been motivated and not organized to promote peace. In contrast, many Jordanians and Egyptians are strongly opposed to peace and normalization with Israel, mostly on ideological grounds. They are highly motivated and organized and wield substantial influence with the public and periodically with their government. There are two main rejectionist groups in Egypt and Jordan. The first are the Islamists, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, both in Egypt and Jordan, the illegal Egyptian group, Takfir and al-Hijra, that assassinated Mubarak in '81, the Jama'ah al-Islamiyah, Sadat, sorry, he came as a result, and the Islamic Liberation Party, Hizb al-Tahrir, and in Jordan. And this movement and groups exercise considerable clout through the network of mosques. The Islamic elements in Jordan are more docile and adjustable to the regime, and King Hussein managed to do it very beautifully, skillfully, and they are more, of course, docile than the assertive, antagonistic Egyptian comrades. The second group includes not only Islamists, but pan-Arab nationalist groups in Egypt and Nasserites, and in Jordan many Palestinians who oppose peace and normalization with Israel. These Islamist and nationalist groups control many professional, and this was alluded to it earlier, they control many professional associations and strictly prohibit any ties with Israel. Other influential organs that propagate anti-peace notions are newspapers, radio and television channels, and textbooks. They spread anti-Jewish, anti-Israeli, even unfortunately anti-Semitic assertions. I saw it in my own eyes. I'm alarmed, but this is a fact. I couldn't avoid it. And this is some of the Egyptian and the Jordanian government seldom intervene to eliminate or restrain this hostile propaganda and indoctrination. On the Israeli side, there are religious and nationalist groups that are anti-Arab and anti-Muslim. They do not believe in peace with Arabs and consider Islam as anti-Semitic and evil. Although they are unable and unwilling to abolish the peace process preceded with Egypt and Jordan, these groups have undermined these treaties by doing their utmost to prevent a fair solution to the Palestinian problem through political means, expanding Jewish settlements on the West Bank, sometimes with government approval, as you know, harassing Palestinians, and sometimes attempting to strike at Muslim shrine in East Jerusalem. And can you imagine if it happens? A bazooka or missiles into Al-Aqsa, 1.5 billion Muslims will rise. And this is really a scare. But I think these people are not, don't hesitate to do it. They tried, in fact. From the Egyptian and Jordanian perspective, the unresolved Palestinian issue and the status of East Jerusalem are still the crux of the entire problem, as Sadat said in his speech in the Knesset in '77, or at least it constitutes the major reasons for the absence of war and peace and normalization with Israel. Thus, a fair solution to these crucial issues may warm Israel relations with, not only with Egypt and Jordan, but also with the Arab and Muslim world. This could be achieved if Israel accepts, at least on principle, the Arab League initiative of 2002, which is unprecedented in history. Never before you had such a peace offer. And as you know, it offers Israel peace, security, normalization, or normal relation, to be more precise. If Israel withdraws to the 67 lines, agrees to a Palestinian state with its capital in Jerusalem. There are more details, but this is the crux of the matter. Israel so far did not accept it, even not in principle. But Arab government must also take parallel steps to improve relations with Israel. Egypt and Jordan must provide more socio-economic benefits to their citizens and present them as a fruit of peace with Israel as a neighbor and partner. Second, they must combat the anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic propaganda in the media and textbooks, while stressing the common historical and cultural heritage between Arabs and Jews, children of Abraham. Third, they must curb the influence of anti-Israeli professional associations, while encouraging mutual visits and meeting with Israeli educators, scholars, businessmen, artists, and so on and so forth. Fourth, they must strengthen the strategic cooperation between the Sunni Arab states and Israel in the face of the new common enemy, Shi'i Iran. Show this is a potential alliance, strategic alliance between Sunni Arab countries and Israel. Now, this cooperation should also include Syria, which must be pulled out of this Iranian-led axis of evil to join the Sunni Arab Pragmatic Coalition. I couldn't finish my lecture or talk without mentioning Syria, or Greater Syria. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Maoz, for this broad historical and comparative perspectives and for your vision for a better future. Thank you very much, you, for being patient and staying with us. Before we conclude, I just want to remind you that this is actually the first part of the conference. Tomorrow, the conference would reconvene at the Abba Evan Hall auditorium here at the Truman Institute with two interesting panels. One with established academics, and the second one with young and promising academics from the Truman institutions. I do encourage you to come back tomorrow. Thank you very much.